Okay, so this series is going to be really targeted to the SharePoint administrators or even a manager or director that's over the SharePoint team. And the topic of discussion is going to be governance. Now, when we look at governance, and all this is going to be in the context of SharePoint Online and modern SharePoint, or maybe not modern SharePoint, just SharePoint and the Microsoft 365 cloud, right? So when we talk about governance, the level set, and I think this is what trips up a lot of administrators. When we talk about governance, governance really falls into two main categories under the SharePoint umbrella. And those two main categories are going to be self-service or request service. Now, on the surface, well, before we talk about the difference between the two, let's level set on the definition, what this actually means. So self-service is when you allow your users to leverage the out-of-the-box site request or site creation button. And we all seen it. So in your tenant, so if I go to the SharePoint portal here, you can see in this particular tenant, my Tesla demo tenant, I actually have the create site option disabled. That's on by default. And that speaks to the self-service model when it comes to SharePoint. And that's what Microsoft pushed by default. So it's on by default, and not necessarily saying that it's right or wrong. It's just different. And request service mean that you're going to see what we see here. The site creation option is not available out of the box on the SharePoint portal. And what we do is we drive the user to use a Power App form. And in this Power App form, this is something that an engineer in your organization would create. And basically, they would gather the needed information that, one, speaks to the governance strategy that you have in place, and two, ensure that the key data points that you need for every site is captured. And this is a more control. And this is what we would call request service. So now if you go back to the whiteboard, so that's the definition, right? So self-service means that they can just use the out-of-the-box feature. They create a site. They usually have to make a decision if it's going to be a communication site or a team site template, or they can expand to advanced options and look at the classic things. And as you can see, even with those options, you're taking someone who may never have managed a SharePoint site before, probably was asked to spin up something for their respective department, and they're really just kind of bumping into the night to kind of figure it out. And over time, with those types of use cases where you have novice trying to manage a site, you can create a lot of havoc within the organization. The request service is that you're going to guide them. You're going to ensure key governance capabilities, and we're going to talk through some of those. So this is going to be the new installment or the new series that we're going to talk about. And again, this is targeted for SharePoint administrators, either managers or directors over the SharePoint practice, or even the director that's over the 365 platform practice in general. Okay, now on the surface, now that we level set on the definition, on the surface, you may say self-service is way easier than request service, because self-service, as an IT team or as a SharePoint admin, I don't have to do anything, and where request service, I have to build all this stuff to drive it. And this really is the work that you put up front in the request service would save you a ton of headache in the future. The lack of work that you do not have to put in the self-service will create much havoc in the future. And again, this is not to say that one is better than the other, but the strategies are totally different. And usually when we talk about governance, we have people on the call who mix the strategies, or they pick a pro from the self-service and they pick a pro from the request service, and they try to create a governance plan with the two. And it's like water and oil. It just doesn't mix because the two are totally different, right? So let's talk about really quick. In this video, this series, we're going to focus on request service, because I just think for organizations who's not yet mature with the SharePoint Online, even though if you had SharePoint in the past, if you're not mature with SharePoint Online, highly recommend request service. Now, can you start with one and venture off or navigate to the other? Absolutely, you can. The biggest mistake we see is that organizations would start with the self-service because they feel there's no work to do. You just, it's power to the people, allow them to do what they need to do. We're not going to create friction. And they just leave it wide open. And over time, just like clockwork, over time, it usually takes about 2-3 years, you have mayhem on your hand, right? So self-service, let's talk about a few key attributes you have to have. Self-service, you have to have a SharePoint retention strategy, a very aggressive SharePoint retention strategy. And retention, I mean, it is probably not the right word to use for retention now that I think about it, but it's really one of those that you look for stale or abandoned sites. And with a self-service, you're going to get way more, exponentially more abandoned and stale SharePoint sites than you would with request service under the SharePoint umbrella. If you ever, and to make this point very clear, if you ever deployed Microsoft Teams, and again, if you left it open to self-service to where anyone in the organization can create a team, you would just quickly notice, and this don't even take sometimes not even 9 to 12 months, you will quickly realize that leaving that open was probably the biggest mistakes you have. And it's the exact same thing with SharePoint if you don't have the right strategy in place. So you got to have a strategy to where you're constantly looking for abandoned sites. You're sending notifications to the site owner, confirming if it's still in use or not. You give them a particular timeline. If they only respond in that timeline, you automatically put in the recycle bin, and so many days in the recycle bin, it gets purged, right? And you can extract data and all the files and all the other stuff as you see fit. But you got to have an aggressive SharePoint nutrition strategy. Maybe that's a better term for the self-service model. The other strategy you have to have in place, or technique you have to have in place, is ad hoc training. Again, you're just leaving this thing wide open. The person requesting the site have no idea. You can't guarantee they know what they're doing. Even in request service, you can't guarantee you know what they're doing, but you can put a training requirement module in there. Again, you can get in front of that. Here, you're dealing with the aftermath, right? You're dealing with the after effects. So ad hoc training is I created this site from my department because someone said to go to create it. I YouTubed it, right? I saw the button that I saw on YouTube. I clicked it. I filled out the things to my best of my ability, and now I'm stuck. How do I give people access? How do I manage documents? How do I add metadata to documents? I want to lock this site down to only 5 people. How do I open it up to these handful of people that are outside of that 5? This one folder, this one library. So you get all these basic questions because people who had the ability to create sites had no idea what they were doing or the right training to manage and govern that site, right? So your help desk or some desk has to be, one, fully staffed to manage this type of ad hoc training and to field some of these basic questions, right? Or send them to a site to where they can on demand and learn themselves. But you got to figure out the aftermath type training, and it has to be ad hoc because the questions can be filled from any other direction. And not saying that you won't have those same questions here, but again, you can ensure the basic training is in place, whereas self-service, you're more reacting to it. And then one of the last ones, and there's many, but these are the 3 I really want to focus on, is that you have to have a strategy in place to collapse and merge. And this is, again, one of the most common pain points that happen in the self-service. Collapse and merge, what do we mean by this? You're going to have individuals, maybe someone in marketing creating a site to represent the marketing site. But then someone else in marketing didn't realize that their department site was created because, again, notifications are not being, propagated up to the manager or propagated, informing someone else that probably department heads or anyone like that needs to be informed who can catch these duplicate sites. So now you have multiple initiatives for, at the common denominator, the exact same purpose or the same intent. Imagine a marketing department that have several marketing department sites, each strategically renamed, right, So because you didn't, to avoid URL conflicts, wherever the case may be. But now, as a SharePoint administrator, you're going to be faced with the constant. We have this site over here representing marketing. We also have a different site in this place representing marketing. We need to collapse and merge the two into a single site, decommission one, and make the other one the star player, right? So you're going to run into those. Again, this is just you're reacting to people kind of getting things done. So what are some of the cons? Are the tension, the friction that we get for the request service governance model. And the biggest thing is automation. When you say request service, the number one resistance or the number one rebuttal that we receive is, my IT team is not staffed to create sites. Let the people have at it, right? And this is because of a lack in automation. So with request service, if you don't automate this piece, and there is some work to automate it, right? Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat it at all. There is definitely some work to automate it. But if you have a request service, this is where you actually have the best of both worlds. If you have a request service model and the process is automated to the point where you're gathering the information, you're dumping it into a SharePoint list, that list then triggers a Power Automate that actually creates the site based on the information gathered. That's the best of the two worlds, right? So even if you don't have automation, the same staff that you had to have staffed up, or the same department that you have to have staffed up to help with SharePoint nutrition, to help with ad hoc training, to help with the strategy of collapse and merge, would be significantly less number of staff members needed to create these sites. And usually when you hear about site creation, for some odd reason, it triggers this part in the brain that says, this is going to happen 3 to 4 times every day, and that's going to consume one full-time person's 40 hours a week. And that's far from the case. Even at the most aggressive site, I'm not going to say about the size, but site requests per capita, all right, let's put it that way. Relatively speaking, for medium and large or small and medium organizations, the site request is not as aggressive as we, in our mind, create that activity to be. It's significantly lower. If it is aggressive, now here's the other thing. Now, if you do have the data to prove that this is taxing on one full-time SharePoint admin, then you definitely can benefit from automation. Would I automate out of the gate? Probably not. It's all scenario based. How big you are, are we spinning this up for the organization? Do we have a framework in place so we're expecting a lot of these site requests? Maybe that warrants automation right out the gate. Most of the time, you can automate the data gathering piece, put it in the SharePoint list, instead of triggering the Power Automate to create the site, which is I won't say a heavy lift, but it's significant. Have that notify the SharePoint admin that the site is needed. They spin up the site, and this is where the part of the video we're going to get into the meat of. How do you spin up that site? How do you create templates to consistently spin up sites based on the site types you have? And then once they spin up the site, they set the status on that list item, and that sends an email notification with the URL of the site. The other thing for request service is what information to gather in the form. So let's just collapse that into form data, right? What are the data points that you need in the actual Power App form? So let me show you an example of that. So if I go back to that Power App form, this can be very, very basic. So as you can see, I really have 8 fields, and I would say out of the 8, 3 are probably the most significant. Probably 4, right? So the name of the site is absolutely significant, and based off of that, we're going to come up with the URL. The site type, and absolutely you do not have to have all of these options. I would probably come out the gate with 2. Do you want a department site or do you want a communication site? One of the things with the site types, if you've seen all of my videos centered around site requests and SharePoint administration, you would know that I'm a huge advocate of taking the technology out from the request. Do not put that burden on your end user. They're requesting the site, keep that site type in the context or in the jargon of your organization. Do you want a department site? Because we have an intranet. Do you want a project site? Because we manage projects. Every organization manages projects. Do you want a community site? Because you're chit-chatting or you got a group of people trying to achieve a particular topic. And that could be a fundraiser. That could be a book club. That could be a Netflix club, whatever the case may be. That's a community site. Or do you want a microsite? This is really for branding and marketing in the context of Tesla. This could be a new feature that all the Teslas will have. It could be a new model. It could be a new product. It could be a new whatever. And the microsite will have all the key data points that employees may need to know about that product so they can speak, intelligently about what that product brings to the market. So what you're going to do with these site types, the whole point is that you use these site types and put them in the context of your organization and using the terminology and the jargon that's actually used in the organization, and not, do you want a Microsoft Teams site? Do you want a SharePoint communication site? Do you want a Yammer site? Do you want a Vivid Connect site? All that technology means nothing to the end user. It means everything to us SharePoint professionals, but to the end user, they can care less, right? Because then you have to explain what the difference is. But so you do that with the site type. And then, how many users? Again, this is icing on the cake, really not critical. Data classification, icing on the cake. Usually out the gate, we're not putting in sensitivity labels that's going to govern the data within that site. Ideally, that's the case. But just because when you get to that point in your roadmap, this is a great time to capture that information to apply it later. And then I would say these are the two critical ones. So site name, the site type, primary and secondary owner, like who are the owners of the site, are the critical. Again, self-service, you can't ensure you're going to have at least 2 site owners, which is highly recommended. For request service, we can enforce that, right? And then from here, with the training piece, which I think is another critical piece, you can also validate the training, right? So you can host a webinar, you can host internal training, you can send people out, have training, you can certify someone who's new to the organization who may have been trained on their own or from a previous org that they know what they're doing and they kind of pass your, and that could be anything, right? That can be a Microsoft Form test, right? You give them like 10 of the 20 or 20 of the basic questions they got to pass with an 80% or better, and you log that to a SharePoint list. So every time you get a request, you test that user who's requesting the site or who's the owner of the site, that's probably more important, against that certified training list. And if their email exists in that list, then they're certified and you go. If they're not in that list, then you can put in a different workflow or a different review or approval process that says, hey, this person is requesting this site or they've been identified as the site owner of the site. I don't see them in the training list. Do you vouch for this person? If so, have them take this test. I mean, there's so many things that you can do, but you see the benefit of this now to where a lot of the issues that we identify in the self-service, you can control and you can eliminate those with this request service model. And then description, purpose, this could be for historics or whatever the case may be, right? So that's the basic piece that they're going to fill out, right? So that's going to, when we talk about form data. So if you can automate it, absolutely automate it. If it doesn't cost you too much headache, this is probably the best position to be in. If you can't automate it, the fact that you're capturing the needed information, dumping that to a SharePoint list, you have it for historical reasons, so on and so forth, and then, now you can proceed as needed. Okay, so the last one will be with request service, and I think this falls into both strategies, but it's one of those things that I want to say it's a nice to have, but it's a good intent to have when you're trying to roll out these strategies, and that is a consistent. So this is going to be a consistent look and characteristic. What does that mean exactly? So just imagine some of our site types. One of the site types are a project site. In a project site, there's certain key fundamental features that should exist in a project site. Issue tracking, task tracking, project, like who's the team members, maybe a document library with a folder structure that makes sense for a project. And then you can have basic projects and you can have different flavors of different projects, right? You can grow into that. Don't try to exhaust and define all your site types out the gate. keep them generic, and slowly, organically grow into the micro types of those different broad categories. But the characteristics, the look in the characteristics of the site is everything. So if I have a department site, those have key fundamental components or features. If I have a communication site, key fundamental components and features, right? Again, self-service, you're actually doing your end user a disservice, because now when they create a site for the sake of managing the project, they're pulling all those baseline pieces together manually. Whereas in the request service, you can now build a template that has some of those core components embedded inside of them. And once you provision the site, it comes baseline with some of those core components and templates based on the site type selected by the end user. Okay, so now that we're level set with that piece, in the next video, we're going to go over what does a consistent look and characteristic look like, aka a site template. How do you set up site templates? How do you leverage the site templates? And what is the difference between the out-of-the-box site templates and the request service site templates that we're going to create in this series? So until then, I'll see you in the next video. Talk to you soon.